Good luck.
Thank you, Tim. Actually, I'm not going to talk much about medical research. I'm going to talk about healthcare and how it's going to impact on the workplace in the future. As Tim said earlier, we all have parents. And apart from their care and love and education, what we inherit from our parents is about 6.5 billion bits of DNA sequence information called the genome in 2 sets of 23 chromosomes, half from mum and half from dad. And that genetic information programs our growth and development from the point of our fertilization, at some point in the past, to our adulthood and eventually to our demise. It is an extraordinary program, and the amount of information in that DNA is about the same as the full version of Microsoft Word. But not only programs an individual who can walk, it programs an individual with the capacity to think and learn and grow, our cognitive platform. It's extraordinary, and it's a great journey of our age is to understand that. In that 6.5 billion pieces of information that we have from mum and dad, there are about 3 to 3.5 million differences between each of us as individuals. And that, to a large extent, is responsible for our physical differences and our psychosocial differences, although that's, of course, heavily influenced by our education and experience. Now, one of the most extraordinary achievements of science and technology in the last half century has been the ability to read this information. The first human genome sequence was published in 2001 and cost well over £1 billion to achieve. We can now do the same thing for about £500, and over a million-fold reduction in the cost, the fastest technological revolution in human history, much faster than the computer revolution, although it's been, of course, very much aided by that revolution. So now it's ready for the street, and it's going to come into routine healthcare, and it's going to transform what is the last of the great cottage industries into the most important of the data-intensive industries of the 21st century. The first application, the first cab off the rank in this, has been to understand and diagnose the genetic disorders that afflict 2 to 3% of all children. It's a surprisingly high figure. Children who are born with severe developmental and/or, often both, intellectual disabilities. Genetic diseases. And of course, things like cystic fibrosis will be familiar to you, but most of them are rare because there are so many different genes that can be damaged, and most of them have lain undiagnosed. By looking at the whole genome sequence, by being able to read this from the child and the parents, we can now diagnose 50% and rising of those genetic disorders straight up, which is an extraordinary progress because it allows those parents to understand the nature of their child's condition, which is they're desperate to understand. It gives them closure there. It gives them reproductive confidence to have more children because it can easily be, the problem can be avoided once it's understood. And in some cases, and it avoids the very traumatic and expensive diagnostic odyssey that these families go through because the doctors can't send these families home. So if you can diagnose them straight up with, it saves a lot of time and trouble. And of course, in some cases, transformative outcomes. And I'll just give you one quick example of a little boy that we sequenced a couple of years ago who was chronically in intensive care, bleeding to death internally. He was so often in emergency that his mother slept with him. And when we sequenced him, we realized he had a strange autoimmune disorder which was killing his platelets, so he couldn't clot blood and he was bleeding to death internally. We got the right drug, emergency ethical approval to put him on it because it had been developed for another purpose. And I can tell you 6 weeks later he went home and he's now a happy little healthy boy at primary school. And saved his life and the life of that family. The second big application of this and it's coming quickly, is in cancer. Now, cancer is a genetic disorder. We've known that for a long time, but it's very hard when you look at a kidney cancer or a liver cancer to understand exactly what's going under the hood. Now that we can sequence these tumours, we can find the causative mutations. And I can tell you that the data, much of which isn't published yet, is showing that 40 to 50% of all cancers have treatable outcomes if you sequence the cancer and define the actually underlying cause. And as a quick example, I'll tell you the story of 2 little girls who were both in hospital, Children's Hospital together. One had a thoracic sarcoma. That's a connective tissue cancer in her chest. It was so large, it was crushing her lungs. It was too large to be removed without killing her. She was on oxygen and dying. The other little girl had a glioblastoma in her brain, which is almost invariably lethal. We sequenced both of those tumours and found out, in fact, they were exactly the same cancer. They were caused by a thing called N-track fusion, quite unusual, but a new drug had been developed in the United States to block this particular mutation, and these little girls were put on that drug, and they've now both been declared disease-free. No sign of residual disease. Now, you can imagine how the parents feel about that. Those little girls would have been dead a couple of years ago. Now, this will become the standard of care in cancer, and I think very soon it'll be unacceptable to not have the cancer analysed genetically to work out whether you're in the lucky 50% and rising of finding a treatable drug, because you don't exactly know what the mutation is under the hood until you do that. This will, I think, transform the way people think about the genetic analysis. But it's only the beginning, and we're actually at the first early stages of having personal genomic information standardly incorporated into healthcare records as one of the two fundamental platforms of the precision and personalised healthcare of the future. Within the next 5 to 20 years, and they're subject to consent, but most people in our experience will, because the value proposition is so high, your genomes will be sequenced and analysed, not simply to diagnose, what might be wrong with you at the point of crisis, but to see what's under the hood in terms of being able to optimise your health journey. For example, and these figures may surprise you, about 7 to 7.5% of all hospital admissions in the United Kingdom and in other advanced economies are due to toxic reactions to prescribed medications, and a huge proportion of hospital readmissions. At the other end of the spectrum, 30 to 40% of all drugs are useless because we're underdosed. And the reason for this, and think coffee, Red Bull, Tim. Some of us can have a Red Bull and go straight to, well, maybe not Red Bull, but have a coffee, a double shot and go straight to bed, and others are wired for hours. That's because we have different rates of metabolising these foreign compounds because of variations in the enzymes in our liver. Now, the drug companies pick a dose for a drug that's going to have a limited toxic reaction for slow metabolisers because they build up the levels, but enough efficacy on the other end for people who are fast metabolisers. When we look at the genome, we can avoid a lot of these adverse reactions, but also identify people where the drug dose should be incorporated. You think of a third of all the pharmacopoeia, all the spending on medicines in this country and around the world is functionally useless because people are underdosed. And 7 to 10%, 10% in Europe apparently, of all hospital admissions due to the other end. We can avoid that. 1 in 250 people has a genetic condition called familial hypercholesteremia, which is just basically predisposition to high cholesterol. Only 1 in 4 of those people is diagnosed by cholesterol tests. If they're not diagnosed and not treated, and the treatment is very simple, they'll have a 50% chance of having a severe cardiovascular event in their 40s, 50s or 60s. 95% of all people with hemochromatosis, an iron overload disorder, undiagnosed, walking around feeling lethargic, not knowing they are. It's very easily treated, but a lifetime of lethargy because of iron overload, but also in many cases liver carcinoma or liver cancer, cirrhosis later in life if it's not treated. It's so common that the red stripe on the barber pole is for bleeding from the 19th century. It was so common that people felt better after bleeding, which is a treatment for reducing the iron. I could go on. The people who, and I better not, but there are, we're all walking around with some Damocles swords. 1 in 10 of all couples have a 1 in 4 chance of having a severely disabled child because of a genetic damage. I'm a carrier for cystic fibrosis. I've got the Irish version. I blame my mother, but I can't dig her up to prove it. But my wife, by the way, is largely of Irish ancestry, dash of Portuguese. She has a 1 in 25 chance of being a carrier as well. We have 2 beautiful boys. I don't know if we dodged a bullet or not, but I can tell you, with genome sequencing being standard, this will be an avoidable problem in the future, that people will not have disabled children because the risk can be identified up front and avoided quite simply. So, We're moving forward into a totally new healthcare system which is going to be using personal genetic information to optimise our journey through life, identify which ones of us are at high risk for cancer. We did this recently. 1 in 10 people we identified genetically as being high risk for cancer actually had pre-symptomatic tumours they weren't aware of. Easy to nip out. Don't worry, just turn up regularly for a checkup and we'll nip it in the bud. And think of it this way, much better than turning up late when the tumour is metastasised and we have to try to throw the bus at you to save your life. The whole of healthcare will be transformed, the whole of the structures of healthcare. There'll be a lot of resistance, there already is, but the next 5 to 20 years are going to see an extraordinary change. Now, what does that mean for you? Well, first of all, it means that I think we're going to have a much healthier population, and to that extent, a happier population. Because our health is so important to our well-being and our productivity. Now, that's not something you'll have a big influence on, although I would suggest that you think, as you are already, I know, about the health of your staff and employees and ways in which you might encourage that to be promoted beyond, mama NHS. That's taking personal responsibility, personal interest in people's health, and to encourage that, as I think they do in other economies like the United States, although there are issues there, of course. Issues of equity, but I bring it up because employers actually fund the health insurance of their employees in the United States, and they have a great vested interest in the health of their employees. It's something to think about. People ask about and concerned about the effect of this on employment discrimination and insurance, and I'll finish there very quickly. I don't think it's going to be a problem, but it has to be addressed. The Canadian government has just outlawed genetic discrimination, and the UK government has a moratorium. I think it will be, around the world, will be outlawed discrimination. Now, there will be some productive discrimination, as there is already, in terms of the duty of care of employers to their staff. For example, we already do not permit people with epilepsy to drive cars or fly planes, both in their interest and the interests of the public. There are certain genetic conditions which also qualify under the duty of care. For example, if you lack a particular enzyme gene called alpha-1 antitrypsin, big word, it's just an enzyme, you are at high risk for emphysema, and you should not smoke, but you should not work in a dusty environment, in a bakery or a mine. And there are other conditions which are lethal in certain circumstances. So there will be considered exceptions where the duty of care of us as employers or as society to individuals will overrule their autonomy in that case, and that's in their best interest. The insurance is an interesting space, and I can tell you that the major insurer, or some of the major insurance companies, are now actively considering offering insurance with a promise, a guarantee in writing of no penalty for genetic risk if you have your genome sequenced. Why? Because they've done the actuarial calculations and realised that your risk of having an adverse event, losing, being disabled or worse, die, is actually reduced by forewarning. Nearly every genetic condition which is sitting there in our background under the hood, giving us a risk for some problem later in life, cancer or cardiovascular disease or whatever, is avoidable by early advance warning. So it's in their interests and your interests to avoid that, and I think you're going to see a complete change of tone in the insurance industry where they're going to work with people as individuals to optimise their health journey, still insuring them against the unexpected, including accidents. So I would be positive that this will be something that actually moves healthcare and medicine from being average, standard dose, just hope it works or doesn't make you sick, or clumsy diagnoses, to ones that's well informed. The other half I should mention just in closing is the smart devices. I think we underestimate the influence this is going to have on our future. The smart sensors. We're already producing pills with smart devices inside them that actually tell the cloud when you've taken the pill and recording your vital signs and when you're awake and asleep. They're not on the market yet, but they're not far away. So we're entering a new world of genomic information and big data that will mean that you will be then treated as an individual in your healthcare journey through life. And I think it is going to make us less sick, happier, healthier, and therefore, I think, more productive and enjoying our lives both in and outside of work. So I encourage you to embrace it, but not to do it, unquestioningly. happy to take questions if there's time, Tim. Okay. Thank you.
Now, I was tempted to do the hands up to see who's an optimist after that, but I'll hold off for that for just 1 second. I do want to ask a question around, you touched on the insurance sector, but I suppose the big thing for me, when we were having our first daughter and we had to go through several attempts of IVF, as it were, one of the things that was identified was around sickle cell. Mm-hmm. And that was the thing, me and my wife, and you mentioned around dodging a bullet, and it was exactly that, we thought about that thing. And I suppose my only concern is always that who's in control of that information and what decisions get taken as a result of the identification around genome? Because I think, given the conversations around diversity, we know that having people who are different has brought so much to the table as well. And I always think of the film Gattaca. Have you seen the film Gattaca?
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, has anyone seen the film Gattaca? Where you have that individual who tries to make it through and he refuses to have the blood test. And I suppose my question is, in the hands of who is that information? And how do we safeguard that we don't become carbon copies and we have a photographic replica of everybody who's the same?
Well,
just an easy question to start off with.
Look, at one level, Tim, you'd be horrified if everybody in the room looked like you or me.
Oh no, definitely me. Definitely me.
So we love diversity as people. We just love it. We relish it in every sense. Occasionally, there's discrimination, but we love it. So who's in control? The individual will be. The way that we're setting this up, and we're going to do this in a way that we can report information to the individual as well as to their GPs, and often through the GPs, because we want people to have quality advice about how to act. And it'll only be things that are strongly evidence-based and actionable, one way or another. We're also working, and companies around the world are working on blockchain and other technologies to make this data completely secure at a higher level than bank security. So it's only available when your key goes in and you give permission to the GP or whoever it may be to see it. So personal control, personal autonomy is central to this.
And you touched on the point around the insurance industry. So what are some of the implications that you're seeing now changing with regards to the insurance industry as a whole?
Well, the insurance industry's been clumsy in the past. I don't mean that as a criticism necessarily. If you've got a history of heart disease in your family, you have to pay higher premiums because they don't know whether you've copped the Damocles sword or not. With the new world, they'll know. You'll know. And if you are at high risk, they'll say, look, it's fine, just put a pacemaker in. You're not going to drop dead on the way home from the gym at 40, and we won't have to pay out. So it's in everybody's interest. We'll still insure you against death in an accident or whatever. So I think the whole nature of understanding our genetic diversity and risks will change, and insurance will change productively with it. And I think they'll attract a lot more customers if they do. And
I think that balance around having mitigating elements that you can then be in control of is a really powerful one. To the floor. Anybody got any questions? Well, hands are shooting up. This young lady just here. Wait for the mic to come up. And if you could introduce yourself, so say who you are, who you work for, and then answer your question, that'd be fantastic. The mic's coming to you. The mic's coming to you.
Hi, I'm Angela Littlebury and I work for Quilter. We have London offices and in Southampton in South Africa. I just wanted to ask you a question around Brexit, I guess, dare I say. We're obviously facing some unknown, perhaps, and there's quite a lot of pressure already building around supply for NHS drugs, etc. So where are you at with the government in terms of lobbying them to perhaps use genotechnology so that we can perhaps reduce our bill and be more specific on medication?
Well, Brexit is beyond our control, my control.
So you're not the only one.
So we watch with interest and some degree of alacrity. I think the best answer I can give you is we're working very productively with our European partners. We have a joint program with the French and close arrangements with the Netherlands and other countries because we'll carry on, keep calm, carry on. It is a global enterprise and by and large in this space it's not really discouraged by national borders. We have a a global alliance for genomes for health, which is a volunteer all around the world, United States, Canada, Singapore, Australia, Japan, you name it, China. So I think it's a national endeavour, an international endeavour. I'd also say that in times of rapid technological change, it comes from somewhere else. It doesn't come from Whitehall or anywhere, because they're usually trying to regulate the present and past. And what happens productively in the United States, for example, because they have more nimble, albeit less equitable, medical ecology, will then colonise here very quickly. And I don't think those national border issues are such a problem at the moment.
Mm-hmm. Fantastic. We've been beaten by time, but the power of technology will allow you, my friend, with your dapper waistcoat. You can see the flattery coming here because you can't answer the question. But essentially, if you could send the question we'll make sure that we'll get over to you and get an answer back. Is that okay, yes? So big round of applause
Thank you.
for the Professor.